Mr. President, yesterday the Foreign Relations Committee voted 12-6 again to report the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. This was similar to the committee vote 2 years ago. On December 4th, 2012, the Senate voted 61-38 on the treaty, less than the 2/3 that the Constitution requires for ratification. I expect a similar result if the Senate takes up the treaty again. Yesterday afternoon, the senior senator from Iowa, a friend of mine, a person I have a lot of regard for, spoke here on the floor about the treaty, and as he has done many times, urged its ratification. I don't doubt his sincerity at all, and I admire him personally for the long service he has given to this country. He called the concern that this treaty would undermine American sovereignty and self-government imaginary, hypothetical, and unreal. In fact, he said, quote, "Anyone who is hiding behind that issue does not want to vote for this treaty for some other reason, but it can't be the reason of sovereignty," unquote. Now, I will not speculate about what the senator from Iowa meant by some other reason. He and I have worked hard together to promote the rights and opportunities of all persons with disabilities. I feel deeply about that issue. I feel as deeply as he does. We were partners in the development and passage of both the original Americans with Disabilities Act in 1990 and the ADA Amendments Act in 2008. I take a back seat to no one when it comes to legislation to help persons with disabilities. But since I gave a speech here a year ago explaining my concerns about this treaty's effect on American sovereignty and self-government, I have to respond to the charges by my friend from Iowa. I can only speak for myself, of course, but I am not hiding behind anything, including the sovereignty issue. That issue is neither imaginary nor hypothetical, and it is certainly not cover for some hidden, unexpressed reason for opposing this treaty. As I explained on July 10th, 2013, this is a treaty not with other nations, but is instead with the United Nations itself. Ratifying it would create obligations across at least 25 different areas of social, economic, cultural, and even political life. Article 8, for example, would even regulate the United States to, quote, "raise awareness throughout society, including at the family level, regarding persons with disabilities," unquote. If this is all the treaty did, if it simply stated obligations, I might support it. It would then be generally similar to the treaty regarding child labor that the Senate ratified in 1999. That treaty states that ratifying nations shall take, quote, "immediate and effective measures to secure the prohibition and elimination of the worst forms of child labor," unquote. But these two treaties are radically different. And the difference is the very reason why the Disability Treaty threatens American sovereignty and self-government, and the Child Labor Treaty does not. The difference between these treaties is who has authority to determine whether ratifying nations are in compliance. The Child Labor Treaty leaves that up to the ratifying nations themselves. The Disability Treaty, however, gives authority to determine whether ratifying nations were meeting their treaty obligations to the United Nations. That's considerably different and very dangerous. Each nation must submit compliance reports to a UN committee of experts which uses its own criteria and standards to determine compliance and makes whatever recommendations it chooses. Treaty advocates say that this UN committee will not have actual legal authority to require changes to domestic laws, and even if it did, we would not have to change a thing. I have three responses to that. First, as I explained in my speech last year, American sovereignty and self-government are not so narrow that they can only be undermined by the United Nations literally assuming legal and political control of our country. America is a republic under a written constitution, and in this system of government, the people must have the last word on everything because the people are sovereign over everything. The American people and their elected representatives, not a UN committee, must have the last word not only on our laws and regulations, but also on our priorities, our values, and our standards. Ratifying this treaty would endorse a formal, ongoing role for the United Nations in evaluating virtually every aspect of American life. It would say that the UN, not the American people, has the last word about whether the United States is meeting its obligations in these many areas. That undermines American sovereignty and self-government. The United Nations hardly needs a legally binding treaty to opine on aspects of American life and public policy. It does so all the time. Ratifying this treaty, however, would formally endorse the right of the United Nations to do so. And even worse, subject ourselves to their evaluation. That's a serious thing. And we should think twice before we allow something like that to happen. Second, we may already have the world's most expansive disability laws and regulations. I know because I helped bring them about. But this treaty goes far beyond that. The UN website says that this treaty legally binds any nation ratifying it to adhere to its principles, and the treaty spells out what that adherence will require. Ratifying nations agree to enact, modify, or abolish laws and regulations at all levels of government, federal, state, and local, that are inconsistent with the treaty's principles. But the treaty also requires evaluating and changing any social customs and cultural practices that are inconsistent with those principles. Anyone who has followed the United Nations knows that a UN committee is not likely to look as favorably on American customs and practices as it might on our laws and regulations. Third, even though the UN Disability Treaty appears to have been modeled after the Americans with Disabilities Act, it utilizes a very different concept of disability. For more than 4 decades, American laws in this area have defined disability as an impairment that substantially limits a major life activity. The Disability Treaty, however, states that, quote, disability is an evolving concept, unquote, involving barriers that hinder, quote, full and effective participation on an equal basis with others, unquote. In other words, the UN committee would use a subjective, fluid concept of disability to evaluate compliance with the treaty of U.S. laws that utilize an objective, functional definition of disability. I am pleased to note that even without United States ratification, no less than 34 nations have ratified the UN Disability Treaty since it was sent to the Senate on May 17, 2012. 15 of them since I last spoke here on the treaty a year ago. Yesterday, the senior senator from Iowa asked for someone to explain to him why the Disability Treaty before us today raises concerns about sovereignty, but the 1999 Child Labor Treaty did not. Well, I think I've done that here today. The Disability Treaty gives the last word on whether this nation is in compliance to the UN. The Child Labor Treaty leaves that entirely up to each nation. Mr. President, I understand that senators have different understandings or concepts about such things as American sovereignty and self-government. But it is wrong to say that if I take a different view on that than the senior senator from Iowa, I must somehow be hiding my real reason for opposing this treaty. In our system of government, legislation and treaties are profoundly different ways of addressing public policy issues with profoundly different effects on sovereignty and self-government. I will continue to be a champion for disability legislation, but I cannot support this disability treaty. I will support those who have disabilities and who have difficult times, as I did back then. And frankly, I still remember both my great friend from Iowa and myself walking off the floor to a whole reception room filled with persons with disabilities. All of whom were crying and happy that we had done this in America. America leads the world in our approach towards disabilities issues. In all honesty, I don't want to lose our sovereignty in this issue, nor do I want to turn over our rights and our own self-interest to the United Nations, as good as it may be from time to time. But I've also seen where it hasn't been so good from time to time as well. Mr. President, I suggest the absence of a quorum.